Hello, and welcome to Field Lab Earth, the podcast that's all about past and present advances in the fields of agronomic, crop, soil, and environmental sciences. Today, we'll be talking to Dr. Kristofor Brye about earthworms in the Ozark Highlands. Earthworms are praised as environmental engineers, and their health can be tightly linked with both soil health and soil benefits like carbon sequestration, attributes which are of crucial importance when taking on projects like prairie restoration. It is therefore key to understand the soil properties and environments which are most beneficial to earthworm health. In this episode, Kris will walk us through his research, including how he got started in prairie restoration, the role of earthworms in soil health, and just what kind of conditions these underground allies crave. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but before we dive in, we want to thank our sponsors, starting with Meter Group. Meter specializes in robust soil sensing, innovative weather monitoring, cloud data logging, advanced data visualization software, and more. Their well-published scientific instrumentation is used worldwide in universities, research and testing labs, government agencies, agriculture, and industrial applications. Listen to their new podcast, We Measure the World, to hear how innovative researchers leverage environmental data to make our world a better and more sustainable place at metergroup.com/fieldlabearth. Our second sponsor is Gasmet Technologies, the maker of the GT5000 Terra, the smallest portable FTIR multi-gas analyzer for greenhouse gas and environmental research. Measure carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, methane, nitrous oxide, nitric oxide, nitrogen dioxide, ammonia and water vapor in real time simultaneously from static or automated chambers. Visit www.gasmet.com, that's Gasmet spelled G-A-S-M-E-T, or email sales@gasmet.com for more information. I'm your host, Abby Morrison. Let's talk about science. Hi everyone, welcome to the show today. Today we have Kristofor Brye with us. Kris is from Middleton, Wisconsin. He completed a bachelor's degree in soil science from the University of Wisconsin Stevens Point in June 1995, a master's degree in soil physics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in December 1997, and a PhD in soil physics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1999. His graduate advisor was Dr. John Norman. He started at the University of Arkansas in the Department of Crop, Soil, and Environmental Sciences in June 2001 as an assistant professor of applied soil physics. He coaches and instructs a soil judging team, teaches numerous undergraduate and graduate classes, and does research on a wide variety of topics, including row crops, agriculture and Arkansas, native tallgrass prairies and prairie restorations, greenhouse gas emissions, and septic systems. He was selected Fellow of the American Society of Agronomy and Soil Science Society of America in 2018. Welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Abby. I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Great. We are so happy to have you on the show. Today, we are talking about earthworms and Ozark Highland tallgrass prairies. So, to get us started, can you tell me more about what these tallgrass prairies are in general, kind of what they look like, where they're located? And there's also kind of a unique mound structure to them. So could you tell me about all of those things?
So, they're really widely distributed, really all across the country. We've got the Great Plains in the central part of the United States that, because of moisture limitations, they tend to be more short grass prairies. And then as you move east of the Mississippi River, and of course, I'm in Arkansas and I'm west of the Mississippi River, but as the rainfall and moisture increases a bit to the east, then you get grasses that literally grow taller and their roots grow deeper, and so they're tallgrass prairies a little bit more to the east. They're shortgrass prairies to the west, but still east of the Rocky Mountains. And there's not a whole lot of contiguous area of prairie left anymore. There's some spots around various states that have large tracts of native prairies that have never been disturbed by agriculture. But one of their fates these days is that they're They're pretty easily disturbed from urbanization, from agricultural expansion, or land use change. And a tallgrass prairie these days is actually considered an endangered ecosystem, which is part of the reasons why I feel that it's important to keep doing research in tallgrass prairies. And it certainly was something I brought with me when I came to Arkansas here almost 20 years to the day, not quite, ago. I wanted to continue to do work in some of the prairie tracts that are around. Fayetteville, Arkansas is in the northwest corner of the state of Arkansas in this physiographic region known as the Ozark Highlands. It's topographically pretty variable. We've got some steep hillsides and some high elevation areas, but forest, savanna, grasslands in and amongst the trees were a climax vegetation community once upon a time here in this area. And we still have little pockets. They're not very large anymore, again, because of agriculture and urbanization. Little pockets of these fragmented native prairies that, for a variety of reasons, and many of them come back to just individual private landowners who have felt compelled to keep these tracts of land undisturbed. And then many of them have been purchased by nature conservancies, state government, and they're sort of park areas, they're natural areas where people can go and hike around. Bird watch is a pretty popular pastime with some of the native prairies around. Look at unique flowers, that sort of thing. One of the really unique aspects of the prairies that are down here in the mid-southern United States, and this wasn't something that I was used to growing up in Wisconsin, although I suspect that glaciation once upon a time had something to do with this, but we've got these mound features, prairie mounds. They're not that big, 20, 25, 30 feet in diameter, 2, 3, 4 feet tall in the center, but they're these mounds. They actually call them pimple mounds in many places, and there's no real good explanation for why they exist. Some people think it's been vegetation related, others think it's been burrowing animal related, and there's some wild and crazy additional theories on why these prairie mounds exist. But that was something, another unique feature that drew me even more to studying and to begin studying soil property variation. My main objective really has been for the last 20 years is to create a database of soil properties, particularly soil carbon, and track carbon over time and assess carbon sequestration potential or rates in these native grassland areas that haven't been affected by other human disturbances. So I know that was a long-winded description of native prairies, but it's been since graduate school for me back in the late 1990s that I've started learning and continued to learn. I just like walking around. I mean, I'm one of these people that likes to be outdoors and prairies and being out in the forest. That I'm in my element then, so this really kills two birds with one stone by being able to do some meaningful research in prairies.
Great. Yeah, there's a lot in there that we'll kind of loop back to, so thank you for that. One real quick question, like, how tall is a tallgrass prairie?
Yeah. It's some can be quite tall. I'm a tall individual myself. I'm 6'3". I have walked around in prairies where some of the tall grasses like big blue stem and switchgrass, Indian grass are literally over my head. I mean, they're 7.5 feet tall. Those are in really good optimal growth years when there's ample rainfall. Most of the prairies that I'm working in are probably waist 4 to 5 feet tall grasses at their peak height in the growing season. So yeah, that's an interesting question. I get that quite frequently.
Wow. Yeah, I am quite small, like clocking in just under 5 foot. So this is like, I'm imagining I could have like my own fantasy world
very easily
within,
yes.
just inside of a tallgrass prairie.
You could get lost very easily.
Yes, great for hide and seek, I suppose. Great. Okay. Yeah, that really helps paint a picture of the area. I was definitely wondering how big these mounds were as well. So thanks for that, which I think leads pretty well into my next question, which is about the work that you were doing in these specific environments for not one but 2 projects, actually. So can you tell us what specifically you were after in both of these research projects and kind of how you went about them?
My goal back in the early 2000s when I relocated to Northwest Arkansas was to go around and soil sample these native prairie tracts, and then with always the goal of going back in the future. And many of these locations I've gone back and resampled 2 or 3 times over the last 20 years. And my initial goal was to really investigate soil carbon sequestration. That's kind of a buzz phrase that people might at least vaguely know something about. You know, we've got global warming going on, greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide, increasing concentrations in the atmosphere, and one of the natural mechanisms of attenuating this idea of global warming from increasing greenhouse gas concentrations is allowing soils through the natural photosynthesis process to absorb and store soil carbon. So that's where the prairies really come into a critical aspect in this whole process, being an undisturbed ecosystem that we're not going in and cultivating like we are in the vast cultivated agricultural land use that the Midwest is pretty famous for, the Corn Belt, certainly all the way to Wisconsin and in eastern Arkansas that we have down here where our row crops are at. So after sampling multiple times, you know, we'd go out there and literally we would soil sample, and invariably we would by accident collect earthworms. And it was something that just over time, it's like, you know, it makes sense to go in and see if we could do a survey. First of all, I didn't know if much work had been done at all in native prairies or any work in Arkansas in general with earthworms. Come to find out, there actually hasn't been that much work done with earthworms in general in any ecosystems in Arkansas, let alone native prairies. There were some surveys that were done back in the early 1950s, and that was pretty much the end of much research about earthworms in particular. So we really felt that, you know, earthworms, as they've got this knack for being ecosystem engineers. You know, they are consuming organic matter. They're eating dead roots from previous years. They're incorporating organic matter into the soil and creating that nice, rich, fluffy, black, organic matter enriched material that is so common. So it makes sense that the earthworms are doing a lot of the decomposition of the organic matter. They're cycling this material in prairies. So we should probably investigate a little bit about earthworms. So it turned out that a couple of years ago, my graduate student Carly Hensley, who was an undergraduate with us in our department here, she was an environmental soil water science major, and upon deciding what topics to study in graduate school for her research project, I proposed, hey, you got any interest in earthworms? And lo and behold, she had a couple of classes from a few of my colleagues here in the department that they had done some earthworm sampling as part of lab activities. And so she was at least partially familiar with some of the techniques. And I said, hey, I've been working in these native prairies and in this prairie restoration. What do you think about going out and doing some sampling? And she jumped all over it, and I was really thankful because not everybody enjoys messing with worms. I grew up fishing, and so I was very accustomed to using worms for fishing, but they're pretty gross for a lot of people, and it's a little bit comical, so it really required the right kind of person to be able to wrap their mind around it and be willing to go out and dig up worms and mess with worms. So I'm thankful that Carly was able to do that. And so we devised it really was one study that we ended up splitting because we worked at two native prairie sites that are here that I've had a history of working at. One study site we referred to as the Chesney Prairie. That's up in far northwest Arkansas, not too far from the Oklahoma border, in fact. And that was a tract of land that has been managed by the Nature Conservancy here in Arkansas, and is managed also by the Arkansas Natural Heritage Commission. Those are two agencies that have their foot in the door with managing, looking after, giving out, approving research permits to work in these tracts of land. And then I had another, it's owned and operated now by the Arkansas Natural Heritage Commission, but it was a private landowner's little tract of land. It's about 4 hectares, not very big, little tract of land about 16 miles east of this Chesney Prairie. This second site is referred to as the Searles Prairie. And Searles is a family name from the family that had owned the property, and it was just their personal desire to not sell off every single piece of property that they had, and they kept this little area of this tallgrass prairie, that remnant that extended once upon a time over many, many hundreds of acres here in northwest Arkansas, thousands of acres for that matter. In this area that at the Searles Prairie has got mounds, and actually it's got some really rare orchids that people come and view periodically when they're in bloom. But the Searles Prairie is completely surrounded by urbanized land use. Across the highway, there is now a baseball, softball complex. There are businesses on one side. The homeowner still has their residence on a third side, and the fourth side of this small little tract of Searles Prairie is a condominium development. So it's really this little prairie island out in the middle of urbanization, whereas the Chesney Prairie is out in the middle of a more natural, it's animal agriculture, grazed pasture lands, poultry production, but it's a vaster expanse. So we wanted to go out and see what the influence of Prairie Mounds were. So we went out and collected, we did replicant soil sampling on top of Prairie Mounds and in intermound areas. So with a 3-4 foot elevation difference between the intermound area and the summit really of these short-statured mounds, we wanted to see if there was a difference in earthworm densities. So we did this, we did it in May of one year. We followed up in October of that year. And then there happened to be at the one site was a prescribed burn. And so we went back the following May of the next year after burning had occurred. And so we had 3 time points so we could look at some seasonality to earthworms on the Prairie Mounds and in the intermound areas. And what my students did is went out and excavated a circular, about 30 centimeter diameter circular area, about 20 centimeters deep. And so they pulled out this little chunk of earth and carefully manually sorted through on a tarp and collected the earthworms, separated them into adults and juveniles and counted them. And that was our data collection for our 2 native prairies. We also did this at the prairie restoration sites. As I mentioned, a colleague of mine had Back in the mid-2000s, she actually did an earthworm investigation in the prairie restorations that I was working at back in 2007. And that information had not gotten published, and it sort of was just sitting there, and I'm like, well, we should go back and resample and look at change over time. And that's what we were able to do. So we were able to roughly go back to the same areas where prior earthworm sampling had been conducted, and did the same a number of years later. So the two studies ended up separating nicely. One focused more on the change over time in the prairie restoration, and the other study focused on looking at earthworm density differences in the mound and intermound areas between these two native prairie tracts of land that we've been studying.
Hi everyone, I hope you're enjoying the show. Interested in learning more? Kris's articles, Earthworm Density Differences Over Time Among a Native Tallgrass Prairie and Chronosequence of Tallgrass Prairie Restorations in the Ozark Highlands, and Seasonal Earthworm Density Differences Among Mound Positions and Soil Moisture Regimes in Native Tallgrass Prairies in the Ozark Highlands, published in AgriSystems Geosciences and Environment, are always freely available. Thanks again also to our sponsors, Gasmet Technologies and Meter Group. For Gasmet Technologies, conduct greenhouse gas flux measurements in the field using the GT5000 Terra. Weighing 20.7 pounds, splash-proof IP54 rated, internal pump and battery, and vibration resistant, the GT5000 Terra is a robust and portable multi-gas analyzer for fieldwork. Visit www.gasmet.com or email sales@gasmet.com for more information. Meter specializes in robust soil moisture sensing, innovative weather monitoring, cloud data logging, advanced data visualization software, and more. Their well-published scientific instrumentation is used worldwide in universities, research and testing labs, government agencies, agriculture, and industrial applications. Listen to their new podcast, We Measure the World, to hear how innovative researchers leverage environmental data to make our world a better and more sustainable place at metergroup.com/fieldlabearth. Thank you for being our sponsor. Let's get back to the show. Yeah, I am like a softie for earthworms. I'm like the person who like picks them up off the sidewalk after it rains and like throws them back into the grass, and people are like, "What what is wrong with you?" But I just want them to live. So why not? Anyway. So yeah, what did you find?
Well, earthworms are an important part of the ecology of the soil, and whether we like it or not, or they're gross in any way, they serve a really important function. Like I said, they're decomposers, and they're bringing organic matter in and cycling nutrients to allow the prairie grasses, the other prairie organisms, soil-borne organisms, to function properly and to do things like sequester carbon, taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere in the photosynthesis process, sticking it below ground in the roots. That really is certainly an important environmental and ecosystem service. So one of the things is we wanted to separate between juveniles and adult earthworms. So one of the main, people may not recognize it immediately, but you take that earthworm off of the sidewalk or that's trying to move from one location to another, sometimes you can tell an adult from a juvenile by looking at a morphological feature referred to as a clitellum. The clitellum is this often pale, discolored, whitish, tannish, little circular ring sort of near the tail end of the worm, and that's the reproductive organ in association with adult earthworms. So the juveniles don't have that yet, so we can use that as a pretty easy morphological feature to separate adults and juveniles. And it's interesting, we had some really big differences between our two native prairie sites. This smaller tract of native prairie, this Searles Prairie that I referred to, is only about 4 hectares. And the analogy that I've used in my graduate student and I have talked about it, it's like the earthworms are caged in. It's like a big wall when you got disruption on at least 3 sides of this fragmented piece of ground. Because of that, we had a lot greater earthworm densities across mounds and inner mounds. And in these prairies, we also have areas that are lower in elevation and areas that are slightly higher in elevation. And that creates some differences with water being stored in the soil. So there's these wetter areas, the low-lying areas, and then the more upland areas that are moist, but they're not real wet. So that affects where these earthworms are at, because earthworms need oxygen. They can't stand saturated soil conditions. They need oxygen. That's why you see them pop out of the ground after rainfall events, because they're looking, I mean, they've got to breathe. So they're relocating a little bit. And plus, it's an organism that's mobile. So it's a little bit tricky to look at earthworm differences over time, because not only can they move horizontally and laterally, earthworms move vertically in the soil. So aside from identifying a much larger earthworm density in the one smaller prairie tract of land, both from a juvenile standpoint and a total earthworm standpoint, the other larger prairie tract, the Chesney Prairie, earthworm densities were very uniform. There really weren't any differences between on the mound or between the mounds in the inner mound areas. Weren't much in terms of difference between the really wet soil areas versus the moist areas. But the smaller tract of land, we generally had greater earthworms on the mounds in the wet soil conditions. And that allowed them to, even though it's a wet soil condition, the mound is a little bit elevated, so it kept the soil a little bit more well drained, provided oxygen for those organisms to be present there. So that was pretty interesting to look at what the effect of the mound was. So we had a big effect of the mound or inner mound area at the one location, and essentially no effect in the other location. So what that tells us is that, you know, each little individual ecosystem is its own little entity. We can't make real sweeping generalizations about at least earthworms and where they're going to be and what time of year they're going to be across all sorts of areas that have prairie mounds, that it really comes down to investigating what's going on in those particular areas. So that makes it a little bit more challenging, but that's what we have to deal with when we study natural systems like that. From a restoration standpoint, it was interesting that we also used, because it was in relative close proximity, we used the Searles Prairie data also as sort of that native undisturbed comparative ecosystem to what we found in the prairie restorations. And there were lots of differences, lots of things that we anticipated didn't happen, things that we didn't anticipate did happen. So we found a lot more differences with the juveniles than we did with the adults among these prairie restorations. And, you know, the adults being older, they were more developed, and they were likely, although we don't know this for sure, they were likely more mobile and could burrow deeper into the soil. And we only went 20 centimeters. That's only 8 or so inches into the soil surface. That's where most of the earthworms most of the time will be concentrated. But they do have the ability to move vertically in the soil. And in some of the prairies restorations, we had increases over time, and in other restorations, we had decreases over time. And again, there were a lot more differences with the juveniles than with the adults, and we pretty much attributed that to we were able to sample more juveniles because they were a little bit more stuck and a little less mobile at the time that we were sampling. So again, that's just telling us that earthworms are an important part of these native undisturbed systems, and for us to have a successful restoration of any ecosystem, prairies or forests, we need to do what we can to not only just make the system look like it used to look from an above ground standpoint. We can plant the grasses and grow the grasses, we could plant the trees, but we really need to pay attention to what's going on below ground to do our best to restore some of that natural function. Not just having it look like a prairie, but having it actually function like a prairie. And earthworms are a pretty big, important part of the soil ecology for a restoration to be successful. We want the nutrient cycling to occur. We want the organic matter decomposition to occur, and that helps the rest of the ecosystem to function. Plants and the animals, all the way to the microorganisms, even smaller than the earthworms, that are important aspects of these prairies. So lots of diverse results. We don't have really good explanations for a lot of them yet. Some things make sense, that earthworms are sensitive to how wet the soil is. Earthworms are sensitive to the soil pH conditions that exist. And like with many organisms, if it's too acidic or it's too alkaline, those organisms, that's just not an optimal environment for them. They're going to migrate. They're going to move. At worst, they might die, but at least an earthworm has the ability to migrate. And some of the additional work, not just counting earthworms, we wanted to see what are some of the other soil properties that relate to either the large presence of earthworms or a small abundance of earthworms. And like we said, soil moisture, really wet conditions aren't very conducive to having large earthworm densities. So you need to have a more well-drained, a moist environment, not dry, but not really wet. So there's an optimum middle ground there from a pH standpoint. Again, not too acidic, not too basic. So in that pH 6 to 7 range is probably optimal for a lot of earthworm activity and function. And then some other things that relate to micronutrients in the soil, or soil physical properties like compaction. Earthworms don't like to travel through soils that are compacted. So when you've got increased bulk densities, that's not conducive to earthworm presence. So lower bulk densities, less compaction, more fluffy soil is sort of an analogy that I use that earthworms prefer. They also don't like to move through soils that are really sandy, because sandy soils, coarse textured soils, are abrasive. So that doesn't mean that earthworms aren't in sandy soils, but if they'd have their preference, they will probably steer away from areas that are real coarse textured because they're irritants. They're abrasive to the very thin, fragile, really outer skin layers, epidermal layers of the earthworm. And same with other elements in the soil. Sulfur is one of those that is related to soil pH. So we've identified a correlation where when there was a large concentration of sulfur, that meant that there was going to be a small abundance of earthworms because of sulfur's effect on acidifying the soil. So we really tried to hit a number of different aspects. We look at some different soil properties, physical, chemical properties that related to earthworm abundance, and then tried to assess what the impact of these wet and moist soil areas are, and the mound and intermound areas are, and a little bit of the change over time in the native prairies, and then a longer change over time in the prairie restorations. And we were reasonably successful. There's still a lot of work to be done yet in these in these different prairie areas. Hopefully I can continue to do some as we move into the future.
Yeah, that sounds great. Sounds like this project bore a lot of fruit with a lot more to dig into, pun very much intended. Speaking of, why don't you tell us more about kind of your next research goals with this kind of work?
Yeah, one of the things we intended to do, but we're not able to follow through, aside from being able to separate between adult and juvenile, and then, of course, we can add their numbers together and get total earthworms, we really wanted to be able to do some speciation. We wanted to separate and identify, is this an exotic, introduced earthworm, or is it a native earthworm? So, strangely enough, many earthworms in disturbed ecosystems have been introduced. They were brought over from Europe. The traditional night crawler that we know of, the big worms that are aggressive deep burrowers. We collect them. We use them for fishing. They're an introduced exotic earthworm species. The native earthworms are typically smaller in physical size, but unfortunately, it's not really easy to identify earthworm species by just looking at their exterior. So it requires dissection, and nowadays there's been some big strides made in molecular techniques where you can actually go in and look at DNA profiles in these earthworms and speciate them. That's one direction that we'd really like to go in the future, is to get a better handle on, okay, we've got total earthworm abundance, but what's the proportion that's exotic versus natives? And doing that in a native prairie setting versus a prairie restoration setting where the previous land use was managed agriculture, I think it'd be very interesting to see how the different species interact with each other and just what their distributions are. So that's one direction that we'd like to go in the future, if we're able to do that. And doing earthworm assessments in a greater number of prairies, native prairies, prairie restorations. These were just convenient because they were relatively close to Fayetteville here in northwest Arkansas and close to campus. But there are many other locations throughout Arkansas that I'd really like to be able to do some earthworm assessments in a broader geographic area. And we'll see if that bears out in the future or not. Again, I've got to find the right student who's willing and able to deal with worms before we undertake some of those additional studies. But those are a couple of the future directions that we'd like to go. Of course, continuing to evaluate carbon sequestration and earthworms' contribution to these soils and these undisturbed and ecosystems that are being restored, how well they can function as a storage location for atmospheric carbon will be important for us to continue as well into the future.
Of course. Well, that sounds like a couple of great directions to go in. Super cool that you can use those molecular techniques. That's super neat. I have 3 questions left for you. The first of which is, if people want to learn more about this research or topic in general, where can they go?
Well, doing a Google search is one of the easiest things that we can do these days. Everybody's pretty well walking around with a phone in their pocket. So, just having some curiosity. Looking at, you don't necessarily need to read a scientific journal article, although I would certainly encourage those that are interested in that to do so, to gain some knowledge about things that you might not be that knowledgeable about and maybe take for granted. So just perusing the internet, reading a little bit about some of the basics can go a long way. If you're one of those outdoors people, I really call myself a prairie enthusiast. I like going on hikes. I take my kids periodically. There's some ulterior motives. I may need to go check a data logger at one of the sites or something. So we'll go out and we'll go out and do my little activities, and then we'll just go walk around. We'll see what sort of amphibians, what sort of insects, what sort of plants, birds that we see, other coyotes, foxes, all sorts of things. So just get out and enjoy the environment. Find your local Audubon Society or Nature Conservancy public lands, and just go out and walk around and breathe in the fresh air and enjoy the environment. And I wouldn't necessarily suggest going out there with a shovel and start digging around, but just have an open mind about what goes on below ground, what we don't see very often, and it's sort of out of sight and it's out of mind. And that's one of the things that I tell real young students. Periodically, I'm invited to go to career days at local elementary schools, and I'll bring in a piece of turf grass that's got worms in it, and it's fascinating to little kids to learn about that stuff, what the worms do, why are they there, why are they important that they're there. And so just having an open mind goes a long way, and just keeping your eyes and your ears open about what nature's all about.
Sure. Yeah, great advice. Second question, if people want to then take the next step and get involved with this kind of research or a topic, what can they do?
Yeah, again, it might be contacting your local cooperative extension agent. Maybe it's, like I said, agencies like the Audubon Society or a state agency. For example, in Arkansas, we have the Arkansas Natural Heritage Commission. These organizations very frequently organize activities to go out, and they seek volunteers to help with things like maybe it's eradicating invasive species. So maybe pulling weeds, or later in a growing season, it's going out and doing seed collections that can help take material from native prairies, and then we build a stock for the prairie restorations when those become opportune to be able to establish. You need to have seeds of these different plants. Prescribed burning. Now that's a little bit more involved, but back when I was in graduate school, I was able to, even though I was doing research at the one prairie restoration, they still periodically did prescribed burning, and they need volunteers to sort of help with putting out little fires near the boundaries of tracts of land. I remember they gave us a big, I don't know, as a flapper, and they positioned me in one corner of the prairie, and they said, if the fire starts to encroach out into the border, here's a big square, thick piece of rubber that was attached to a handle, and so you just smother the fire and don't let it get out of control. So being able to volunteer in these areas it goes a long way to help preserving those areas that have been undisturbed, and help creating new areas from a prairie restoration standpoint. Those projects aren't numerous, but it doesn't take a lot of searching to find out where those areas are, and maybe they're closer than you think, to be able to volunteer some time on a Saturday morning to do some invasive plant control or help collect seeds, to get involved and volunteer some time.
Yeah, another great way to get out in nature as well. Final question for you is, what is one fun fact that people would not know about you if all they had was your research?
Well, I'll give you one standard, and I'll give you one a little bit unstandard that I feel actually really proud about. So I'm married. I've got 4 kids, ranging ages from 13 to 18. In fact, my oldest child just finished his freshman year in college here at the University of Arkansas in the environmental soil and water science major that I advise for and I teach classes in. And I've actually had him in 2 of my classes already, which has been a unique experience. But the a little bit more uncommon, unstandard, unique fact is my father grew up in a small farming community in west central Wisconsin. The community is called Coon Valley. And Coon Valley, Wisconsin has actually got some really, really important claim to fame in the area of soil science and soil conservation. Coon Valley, Wisconsin, and there is a river, it's called the Coon Creek. The Coon Creek watershed in west central Wisconsin was the home location for the United States' first watershed scale demonstration and research project to investigate ways to control soil erosion. And I remember growing up, I didn't grow up on the farm, but the farm is still in our family. It's still in existence in Coon Valley. I did spent a lot of weekends and lots of weeks during the summer when my grandmother was alive. And I remember there's a Wisconsin highway state historical marker that is right on Highway 14 that runs right actually through the middle of the family farm's property that commemorates the Coon Creek watershed back in the early 1930s. And, you know, it didn't really resonate with me as a youngster, but certainly going into college and choosing the major that I did, which was soil science, I began to learn about the importance of soil conservation and soil erosion and correct management practices to minimize soil erosion. And here, come to find out, the farm, the area that I had been spending a lot of time recreating in, growing up in and around, the farm that my dad grew up on, was right in the middle of one of the most successful demonstration projects that the country has ever undertaken. And that's where we have now come to use management practices like contour strip cropping, and just planting on a contour instead of up and down a slope, plant across the slope. Things like that, which seem to be pretty commonplace nowadays, weren't back in the early 1930s and before that. So that's something that most people would not know, that I have an intimate, deep connection with the discipline of soil science that I chose to devote my education and my research career to, all in the name of soil conservation.
Wow. Those are some great fun facts. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's so nice to have it run in the family, I guess. Yeah, so thank you for a very informative conversation on earthworms and soil conservation and the Ozark Highlands. Thank you for being on the show and for everything you do.
Absolutely, my pleasure. I'm really pleased that I had the opportunity to talk a little bit about what I'm passionate about.
Thank you for listening to Field Lab Earth. You'll find links to today's resources in our show notes or on our website. If you have any questions, comments, or recommendations for show topics, please contact us at podcast@sciencesocieties.org or on Twitter @FieldLabEarth. If you'd like to hear more content like this, please subscribe, and don't forget to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Podchaser, Stitcher, or anywhere else you find your podcasts if you like our show. This podcast is a joint production of the American Society of Agronomy, Crop Science Society of America, and Soil Science Society of America. Special thanks to Lobo Loco for the use of their song Spook Castle on the intro and outro of our show. Opinions and conclusions expressed by guests are their own and are not considered as those of the American Society of Agronomy, Crop Science Society of America, Soil Science Society of America, its staff, its members, or its advertisers.